So hello everyone, indeed I am Maarit Koponen and my colleague Meri Nurminen here. I will have to say right up front that it would indeed be very interesting to hear some practitioner or user experiences of machine translation in the context of government, NGOs and accessibility. Unfortunately, we don't have any of that to report to you. Rather, what we are talking about is in fact a survey study that Meri and I have conducted as part of a forthcoming book on Saavutettava Suomi, Accessible Finland, translation and interpretation as a building block for equal society. So this is a book project started by Maija Hirvonen and Tuija Kinnunen at the University of Helsinki, and the book approaches accessibility and particularly linguistic accessibility from multiple different angles. So we have chapters on various types of issues related to language accessibility and equality in the book. It's currently under review, so I can't really advertise it to you yet, but keep an eye out. It should be coming, we hope, quite soon. Okay, and the chapter that Meri and I have written for this book deals with information accessibility in general, what it means, what do we mean when we talk about access to information, why is it important. We discuss the concept of linguistic accessibility and how machine translation can perhaps serve as a tool for advancing and promoting access to information. We will discuss some example projects of how machine translation has been used or is being developed for use in the context of information accessibility. We discuss some of the opportunities and risks related to the use of machine translation in this context, and then finally some concluding remarks. So the basic idea, what is it that we talk about when we talk about accessibility to information or access to information? Access to information is a fundamental human right. It is not as such listed in the Declaration of Human Rights, for example. Rather, it can be derived from other rights, such as right to free expression, education, and so forth. But access to information is recognized, for example, by UNESCO here in a report as being fundamental to the enjoyment of other rights. So in order to be able to fully participate in society and make use of your rights, you need to have information. And one of the potential stumbling blocks there, so one thing that can become an obstacle to information and thereby the enjoyment of rights is language. So the idea of which languages are we providing information in and how accessible is that information to different people. More broadly, to define accessibility a bit, we're probably more used to thinking of accessibility in terms of, say, physical access. So, for example, ramps that make buildings accessible for someone who is using a wheelchair. Or sensorial accessibility related to the senses, for example, hearing or sight, or also cognitive accessibility, so related to different cognitive abilities. But linguistic accessibility is also part of accessibility in general. So linguistic referring to language and how language makes information, in this case, accessible. So we can look at linguistic accessibility from the point of view of different cognitive abilities. So you can think of cognitive disabilities, for example, where perhaps somebody has difficulties processing written or spoken language. You might have solutions for those people to simplify the language, for example. In Finnish we talk about selkokieli and similar initiatives. May have cognitive disabilities due to injury or such, but also your linguistic accessibility may be limited due to insufficient competence in predominant languages. So in Finland, for example, we have heard that information from officials official sources, like Kela, for example, are generally available in Finnish, in Swedish, to some extent in Same and other minority languages, some information in English, but not all, and then even less in other languages. So if you don't happen to have sufficient competence in one of those languages, you are not getting all of the information that you need. The trends we are seeing currently, we talk a lot about digitalization and how that affects society. We talk about the information society, where information is key to everything. So what we see is that currently there is even more information that people need in order to participate in society. There is a higher need to access information. At the same time, increased global mobility means that the languages are becoming more varied. We have larger numbers of people living in countries where they don't speak the official or otherwise predominant language. So we have also more need or higher need for information in different languages. And as a quick example from a very interesting presentation in the ELRC conference in 2016, a talk by Eila Ratasvuori. She mentioned that the population in the city of Helsinki, at that point 13.5%, were people whose mother tongue is some other than Finnish or Swedish. And that is projected to grow, so likely the number of people not speaking Finnish or Swedish in Helsinki keeps growing. I quite recently heard that the city of Espoo has made the decision to make English one of their, not official languages, but one of the service languages that they offer. So a possible choice for a language in which you get public services. Okay, so what we see is we have a growth in the number of people who need information in their own language. So as said, currently it is very limited as to what information you can get in which languages. And I think it was already mentioned in a previous talk that English is the solution currently being offered. So using English as a lingua franca, which is not a perfect solution, but is something that is possible with the current resources, but we are seeing this growing need for a variety of languages that we need to provide information in. At the same time, if we have these two arrows going up and up, the arrow for resources is definitely not going up. So resources available for human translation, both in terms of financial resources and also human resources to perform translation, are not increasing, let's say. So what are we here to tell you? How could machine translation perhaps work as one solution? So this is something that we have looked into for our survey that forms the basis of the book chapter I mentioned. How could machine translation be used? And we are perhaps more approaching this from the angle of using machine translation with post-editing, so in a context where professional translators use machine translation as their tool to improve efficiency, so you would be able to translate more content. Well, it says at the same price, but also in the same time frame. So if your human resources are limited, those humans would be able to translate more, provide more information content in the same time. Also to enable more varied languages, so bringing new languages, obviously you need an investment in terms of money and other resources in the beginning, but perhaps in the long run it will enable the provision of more varied content and information. A couple of words about the Finnish context. Much of this we have heard already today in the other talks. So as we know, in Finland and for Finnish, so when translating into or from Finnish, machine translation has so far been used relatively little. As we know or have heard, Finnish is a challenging language for machine translation. There have been quality challenges, even to a larger extent than for some other European languages, for example. However, there is development and implementation going on in Finnish LSP, so in the language industry. There was a quite recent survey which showed that something like 1/3 of Finnish language service providers and freelance translators have adopted machine translation, at least for some purposes in some situations, although the use was not very wide so far. We have heard about the governmental efforts, the Prime Minister's office, so valtioneuvoston kanslia, Kela and Verohallinto, so the tax office, that there are some efforts going on. Obviously, development in the European Commission, as we just heard in a previous talk. And digitalization of public services is a key project for the government, and perhaps this is something where machine translation could be of use. So providing public service information in different languages. Okay, and I will hand it over to Mary to give us.
Could I just tell you when to turn it? Does that work? I'll just tell you when to turn it.
Okay, well, sure.
Yep. All right, so do you hear me okay? Yep. So moving on to the practical, we wanted to give some examples of what other countries and also non-governmental agencies have done in this field. There are examples around, so just a kind of brief overview of some of those. In the early years, it took a large, huge amount of resources to develop machine translation solutions. So in the early years, it was only the very, very big players that got involved, although, of course, they got involved quite early. The Pan American Health Organization in the 70s, along with the EU. Just one little fact, by 2009, 90% of PAHO's translations go through a machine translation part of their pipeline. So it is a fully integrated part of their process. But anyway, there were no other very big efforts ongoing in the early years. And of course, since then, we got into statistical machine translation and more of these open source solutions. So it became possible for smaller players to also start experimenting and implementing machine translation. Nowadays, a few recent projects, we have our friends from Tilde here, who have been implementing solutions for countries that have the EU presidency. And they developed it originally in Latvia for Latvia's stint as the EU presidency. But we got interested in the other part of that, which they did at the same time, which is that they noticed that they had a large percentage of people who spoke Russian at home. So this was like their main language. And they decided that these people do not have full access to government. You cannot say that they're fully accessed citizens if they don't have very good access and accessibility to official documents in their own language. So they implemented at the same time as the EU presidency thing, Russian-Latvian solution. And part of that was for the government workers to use. They had MT, they had post-editing tools so that they could produce more documents into Russian. But there was also an internet portal which allowed people to just go into it and translate for their own needs any document that they would find. Another project in Sweden, and this is ongoing. I wonder if anyone knows in the audience about the Dig Include project? Okay, one person. Not very many. This is a consortium, an effort. There are some universities involved and some private companies involved and governmental agencies involved. And the whole idea is to increase inclusion in society. And there are different focus groups, some that we've mentioned before, people with disabilities, cognitive problems, senior people with reduced cognitive abilities, and then immigrants. And so they wanted to make sure that in conjunction with moving more and more services online, they also increase efforts to include more people and make sure that they can really use the services. So what's included, it's a collection of tools they are putting together. I think they are in the second phase of this project right now. So this includes writing support for the government officials who are producing texts, some efforts in easy Swedish. I don't know about my translation. Selkosuomi, selkoruotsi, I guess you would call it, in Finnish at least. Multilingual terminology, which has been discussed here also, and machine translation. And their focus are official websites, I think Linköping, city of Linköping, and the county and the state. But also there's a health information site that is one of the first customers of these solutions. But the languages they're focusing on, these are not the EU languages. So they are introducing some of these immigrant languages. In their very first phase, Arabic and Kurdish are being developed. They have people that they have hired to help develop the solutions for that. And these are very much intended to be translator tools, so it will be a machine translation plus post-editing environment. For, just interestingly enough, further waves of languages, Finnish is one of the ones that will be included eventually as an immigrant language. In Japan, there was an effort. These are municipal sites, websites, that need to be in English as well, but they noticed that the quality of the English was lacking, and there was a problem with resourcing, so they decided to try MT solutions. They included controlled writing, so pre-editing, which is something that's studied in research quite a lot. How much does it help to have simplified or have some kind of editing phase before you put it through MT? And the focus, again, was governmental websites. They did find that the controlled editing, so focusing on those source texts to make them ready for MT, did show an improvement over the MT results. And it also led to more efficient writing. This one I just recently included. This is another consortium. The one great thing in the MT field is there's a lot of the word consortium going around where research and business and governments work together. This is an area where they had Japanese agricultural experts and Vietnamese farmers, and they noticed that they could have better crops and use less fertilizers and other chemicals if they had better knowledge. So they put together a chain where they have the experts in Japan and the farmers and their children is an important part of this chain. Youth-mediated communication, they call it, because the children are the ones who know technology. But the experts and the farmers, they're communicating using machine translation. And this solution includes Japanese and Vietnamese, but also English as a pivot language, which has its own problems they've found. But anyway, this started in 2011 and is ongoing. So some kinds of very innovative solutions people are coming up with. Another area where MT is starting to become a very important component is in crisis management. After the Haiti earthquake in 2010, at least in a Kite's conference, we heard the story of how Microsoft implemented a solution for Haitian Creole. And after the whole thing was over, they got together and said, what was needed here? What happened here? And they realized that MT can be a very important help in managing crises, but it would be helpful to be prepared for that. Even though you can't be prepared for the languages, you can be prepared by making a framework and outlining terminology that tends to be included in these catastrophes. And from that initial cooperation, we have now, it's grown into the Interact project, I think it is. Again, this is a consortium of different players from research and business and government. And their whole goal is to make this framework and readiness for using MT in future crises.
Okay. So here, basing on this survey of what is going on, how is machine translation being used or at least tested for various kinds of purposes, some thoughts on the opportunities that machine translation offers, but also keeping in mind the risks it may pose. So to cover couple of basic things first. What is it that machine translation can do? It can speed up human translators' work. This is something that we have already heard about today and also previously, how machine translation, when it is of good quality, and generally when dealing with trained systems for the specific purpose, it can allow you to have more content translated with the same resources. We can expand to new languages, so bring in, especially for the crisis translation use case, they have tested the very quick deployment of new resources for machine translation. So bringing in language pairs where you did not have machine translation systems previously. We talk mostly about using machine translation as support for human translators' work here. We will also talk about using raw machine translation as such, a little bit more about that in a moment, just to let you know. But what machine translation cannot do is to completely replace human translators. This is probably something we have all seen, how very soon there will be no need for any translation because neural machine translation is so good that humans are not needed, or similar claims. So we would caution against this. There was a recent quote I saw on Twitter. I don't remember exactly where. I don't know if Mary remembers it, but it was Mike Dillinger who pointed out that we know that humans and AI together make a very efficient team. So why focus only on developing the artificial intelligence? Why not work on both of them? So having the humans and machines working together. Another thing that machine translation cannot do or be is to be successful without good planning and proper resourcing. So these machine translation projects won't work unless a great deal of planning and resources are put into it. Okay. Some of the risks. The use of raw and unedited machine translation in the wrong place, probably something we have encountered, many of us, if not all. So machine translation quality, despite some of the hype, is still somewhat lacking. We saw some interesting examples in the e-translation talk just now. So that is a challenge if you are only providing people information as raw machine translation, which may contain errors and may contain even very severe errors in meaning, then that may be worse than not providing them any information at all. So they will be getting misleading or unintelligible information. There's also a question of perception. This is something that Lynn Bowker in Canada has written about. If we offer some people information as either the first language, information produced in the first language, or as a good quality human translation, whereas others, we tell them, okay, well, here's this raw machine translation, that's good enough. How is this going to affect the perception of those languages and speakers of those languages who get the machine translation only? Does it make the perception of them lesser? So in some ways, while we may have the idea of promoting equality and equal access to information through machine translation, it could also end up reducing equality in these terms. Okay, but for more positive thoughts, so what can we do?
So I think one of the most important things to do, and I was glad to hear the people here who've been talking have covered this kind of thing. There are different types of information. That's come out over and over again. It's worth identifying what is the very critical or high-risk information, and then information that is not as critical. And we said that critical, of course, means information that, if it is misunderstood, could cause harm. This is very clear. But there is also information that the risk could be there that if people misunderstand it, they end up calling people in the government to ask further questions, thus leading to an increased workload of the people who have to answer the questions. So this might be another identifying factor or a criteria to use when you're identifying what is high risk and what isn't. If misunderstanding will lead to more work, then it's high risk. Some examples, I mean, these are, again, easy to identify: health, immigration, social welfare, legal things, obviously taxing. These kinds of information types should not ever be passed out as raw machine translation. Whereas there also exist non-critical kinds of information. Things like general descriptions of organizations. What do these things do? What are the opening hours? It might be possible to find types of information that it would be okay to offer raw or lightly edited post-editing. So after this identification is done, it would be very simple to say anything high risk, it must be fully post-edited by a human, whereas non-critical is something that maybe light post-editing might be worthwhile. That might take further investigation and analysis, but this kind of classification can help in later stages of figuring out what to do with different information. So some conclusions then. We do think that MT could be used as a tool to offset or help in the high cost of providing information in the multiplicity of languages that might be needed now and in the future. It can be a help. However, it is not a replacement for human translation, as we all know, and it does require ample resource or good enough resourcing and planning to succeed at. Thank you. That worked fine.
Okay, please, questions for coffee? Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about this idea of non-post-edited translations by MT. If they are published somewhere, online, wherever, then what do you say about the risk of people at the language bank harvesting them, and then people end up sort of doing research on compromised data? So you have any ideas about that?
Well, one of the best practices that you see nowadays is whenever there's anything where it is raw machine translation, usually there's a very large disclaimer, because people need to know what that is. And that should be assigned to the people reading it, that this may contain mistakes, but it also should be assigned definitely to anybody who might be using the data for something. So I think nowadays you always see a disclaimer whenever this is.
And obviously, if we're talking about data harvesting, then it needs to be in the metadata as well. So in addition to having the visual reminder for the reader that usually says something like, this content has been machine translated, it may contain errors and we take no responsibility of what's in there, there should also be a metadata indicating that it's raw empty. Whether content providers actually do that is a whole different question.
Okay, more questions, comments?
Voi kysyä myös suomeksi.
Yeah, the classification, not critical and non-critical information. In my opinion, it also affects who is translating to whom. For example, if I translate critical information to you, then obviously there's a risk. But if I myself use machine translation to understand your critical information, then I think it's a different case. And besides, the risk is on me then. So what do you think about this?
I think an example from this morning would be somebody brought up that there is a need for the people who are handling paperwork to understand paperwork coming from other countries. So I think that might be a similar thing. There is a risk there also, I think, because if you're using that information for something that could, again, it goes into the classification, if it could affect somebody's life greatly, then that should be labeled high risk, I think. If it's you and me, well, I'm sure. I think there's also the case where there is a chance, if it is online communication, for example, emails, there is a chance to ask for clarification and ask to make sure that you have understood correctly. And these kinds of, this is kind of a different information type, but that would make it a different kind of case too, because the chance to clarify, ask for backup, ask an expert, if that's there, then that would help us be able to use that information or use raw machine translation. But if it's not there, and there are decisions being made on the understanding of that only from raw machine translation, I would see that as risky.
I wonder if you were thinking of the distinction of whether the machine translation is done by the content provider who then publishes it versus somebody who is just reading, let's say, a web page in a foreign language and then runs that through Google Translates or whatever. Okay. Yeah, I mean, obviously there is a risk then if someone, let's say, who is an immigrant in Finland goes to Kela's web page and then just machine translates it using Google Translate. There are risks there, obviously. And I think we need kind of general education of what the risks of machine translation are. You can't really, regardless of how high risk the information content is or like how critical the information is, you can't exactly prevent somebody who's reading it on a web page from taking it and going to Google Translate. At least at that point you would hope that at least they're aware that it's a machine translation, and you would hope that they are also aware of the risks involved in that.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a good time to have a coffee break. Thank you,
Thank you
for your insights. So